Hello everyone, this is Matthew with Evidence-Based Faith. Thank you for coming onto my channel. Today the topic that we're going to be discussing is, are the Gospels really anonymous? One of the main things you hear atheists say, along with other people as well, is that the Gospels were originally anonymous. But is that really the case? Let's examine this further. To start with, the names of the four Gospels have appeared on the manuscripts for well over 1,000 years. However, the claim is that these four names may not have been present on the original manuscripts of the Gospels. The earliest Gospel manuscripts in which the titles have survived seem to have been copied in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. That's a century or more after the Gospels were originally written, and that's one of the reasons that some scholars claim that the New Testament Gospels were originally anonymous. But what people need to understand is that many of the earliest Gospel manuscripts have not survived sufficiently intact for us to know whether or not the manuscripts originally included titles. The portions of the manuscripts that would have preserved the titles have crumbled into dust or become separated from the rest of the manuscripts over the centuries. So the absence of titles on the surviving portions of the manuscripts does not mean that no names were originally present on the manuscripts, because when we examine all the manuscripts that have survived sufficiently intact to include a title, here's what we find. Not one of these manuscripts omits the ascription to the author. In all the manuscripts that have survived sufficiently intact for any title to be present, there is a title, and that title links the text to the same author that's ascribed to that gospel in the New Testament today. The biggest issue for the theory of anonymous gospels is the fact that no anonymous copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John have ever been found. Brad Piter has pointed out that they do not exist. As far as we know, they never have. But then why do skeptical scholars continue to claim that the New Testament Gospels were originally anonymous? According to Bart Ehrman, it's because of the wide variety of titles for the Gospels. In his opinion, the variety of different titles in the Gospel manuscript shows that the titles were added in different locations long after the books originally began to circulate. But what exactly is he referring to when he says a wide variety of titles? In almost every instance, the variety is limited to whether the title is according to the author or whether the title is gospel according to the author. And this, of course, means that his wide variety isn't really wide after all, especially when we consider that in the title manuscripts of the New Testament Gospels, there are no variations in which authors are ascribed to which Gospels. For example, the title of Matthew's Gospel in the manuscript known as Codex Washingtonianus is Gospel according to Matthew, and the title of the same Gospel in Codex Sinaiticus is according to Matthew. But both codices explicitly ascribe the Gospel to the same source, which is Matthew. In Codex Alexandrinus, Mark's Gospel is Gospel according to Mark, whereas Codex Vaticanus has the abbreviated title according to Mark, spread across the tops of 2 pages. However, both recognize Mark as the author. This is the pattern that we see in every surviving Gospel manuscript that includes title. Even though the wording of the titles may vary slightly, the ascribed author never changes. Every title manuscript of John ascribes authorship to John, never to Matthew or Mark or Peter or Andrew or anyone else. And every title manuscript of Luke ascribes authorship to Luke, and the same is true of every title manuscript of Matthew and Mark. So given this consistent pattern that we see with the titles, we need to consider what would have happened if they really would have been fabricated. In the 2nd century, the New Testament Gospels spread pretty rapidly from church to church throughout the Roman Empire. Gospels could be found in Rome, where Justin the philosopher referred to Mark's Gospels as the Memoirs of Peter, in Asia, where a pastor named Papias was gathering information about their origins from eyewitnesses, in Lyon, where another pastor known as Irenaeus relied on the 4 Gospels to refute heretical teachers in his church, and they probably spread as far as Egypt. If you consider the wide geographic distribution of the Gospels in the 2nd century, what do you think would have happened if 2nd century Christians had suddenly decided to start fabricating names for the Gospels to make them seem authoritative? Keep in mind, Christians in one region could not quickly contact Christians in other regions. And even if they had been able to get the same information to everyone at the same time, there was no single human authority who could require all Christians everywhere to link the same titles with the same Gospels. Therefore, if 2nd century Christians had fabricated the authors of the Gospels, one church might have christened a gospel with the name of Andrew, while a different church ascribed the same gospel to Peter or Thaddeus or Bartholomew. If that had happened, we really would find Ehrman's supposed wide variety in the manuscript titles. Each gospel would have had a variety of different names and different manuscripts depending on where in the Roman Empire you travel to. But that pattern isn't even close to what we find when we examine the ancient manuscripts. Throughout the title manuscripts, the literary forms of the titles may vary, but the same author is ascribed to the same gospel in every titled manuscript. Despite Ehrman's claim to the contrary, there is no wide variety of titles. But then the next question is, how were the same authors' names linked to the same gospels with such uniform consistency in a world where communication was far from instant? I think the most obvious and reasonable answer to this is that the New Testament Gospels was linked to a particular author from the moment in the text first began to circulate. This might have been done by the names being inscribed on syllaboi or flyleaves. During this time, that's what they used. And then along with that, it's very likely that there was an oral history about each gospel's origins that was passed from church to church whenever one community of believers shared a gospel with another community. Quite possibly, both of these phenomena were happening at the same time. So if an oral account of each gospel or a written inscription did accompany each gospel as soon as it began to circulate, then it really isn't a surprise that we find accounts of the origins of the Gospels in ancient sources separated by hundreds of miles. And in fact, that's exactly what we discover in words that have survived from the 2nd century. So let's take a look at what 2nd century Christians in locations ranging from Asiana to Italia to Gaul had to say about who wrote the Gospels. Papias of Hierapolis, born in the 1st century, writing in the early 2nd century in the region now known as Western Turkey. And I quote, "Mark, having become Peter's translator, wrote down accurately whatever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. He accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving an ordered narrative of the Lord's sayings. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in writing things as he remembered them. Of one thing he took special care not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements. Matthew put together sayings in the Hebrew language, and each one translated them as best he could." End quote. Papias had gathered his information about who wrote the Gospels through conversations with eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus. And Eusebius of Caesarea had preserved his words from texts that he possessed in the 4th century. Irenaeus of Lyon, born in the early 2nd century, writing in the late 2nd century from the region known today as France. And I quote, "There are 4 Gospels, and only 4, neither more nor less. Christ is at the center of them. John actually speaks of his kingly and glorious sonship to the Father in his opening words. In the beginning was the Word. Luke begins Zechariah offering a sacrifice. Matthew chooses first of all the Lord's human genealogy, and Mark leads off by calling on the prophetic spirit which invests humanity from on high. Matthew issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own language, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, Peter's follower and translator, handed down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned on his chest, published a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia." End quote. Irenaeus had probably acquired at least some of his information from Polycarp of Smyrna, who was born in the 1st century and martyred in the mid-2nd century. Polycarp had been a companion of Papias. Both Polycarp and Papias knew John, the disciple of Jesus. Muratorian fragment, late 2nd century, probably from Rome, on who wrote the Gospels of Luke and John. And I quote, "The 3rd book of the Gospel is according to Luke. Luke, the well-known physician, after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken with him as one zealous for the law, composed it in his own name, according to widespread belief. Yet he himself had not seen the Lord in the flesh, and therefore, as he was able to ascertain events, so indeed he begins to tell the story from the birth of John. The 4th of the Gospels is that of John, one of the disciples. To his fellow disciples and overseers who had been urging him to write, he said, 'Fast with me from today to the 3rd day, and what will be revealed to each one of us, let us tell one another.' In the same night it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should write down all things in his own name, while all of them should review it. And so, though various elements may be taught in the individual books of the Gospels, nevertheless this makes no difference to the faith of believers, since by the one sovereign Spirit all things have been declared in all of them concerning the birth, the death, the resurrection, his life with his disciples, and his twofold coming. The first in lowliness, when he was despised, which has taken place. The second, glorious in royal power, which is still in the future. End quote. Okay, so now that we've taken a closer look at the evidence that we have for the Gospels, do we have any reason to think they were originally anonymous? I think the very obvious answer is a hard no. Every manuscript that has survived intact enough to have a title has a title. Those titles are linked to the same Gospels in the New Testament today. And we also have the writings of the early church leaders, which state very clearly that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that these were the only ones written. There is no evidence that indicates the Gospels were originally anonymous. All the evidence strongly supports the contrary. Well, guys, that's the video. So let me know what you think, and remember to like and subscribe.